Mexico a lot of times.
Yeah, or Canada.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Canada is still more expensive too, you know, what was it, around $50. But,
I want to just start so I have it on. John
Yeah.
Stutterheim.
yes,
Stutt.
Erheim.
E-I-M, okay. And John, John.
M. Oh, John, yes.
With
I'm
an
sorry,
H, yeah, not the Jon version. Now, you were born where? Where were you born?
In Surabaya, Indonesia. That was at that time the former Dutch East Indies. My parents came to the Indies for, my dad was an accountant and he worked for the government. He found a job. Think about that. That was 1928, he came out. That was just before the Depression. And he held 1 or 2 jobs all throughout the Depression. So he was really a worker.
Now, the Dutch Indies are famous for spices?
Oh, many, many products. Oil, but that's what the Japanese were after. Rubber. Quinine, 90% of the world production of quinine came from the western part of the island of Java. Palm oil, copra, rice, tobacco, tea, coffee, Robusta coffee, bauxite, tin,
Wow.
iron, natural gas. I mean,
Once in a while.
okay.
So, as a child, it's interesting because for most American children of your era, Pearl Harbor was the big turning event.
Yes. We had a very good living. I was not spoiled. My parents made sure about that. And I had an attitude that was exploratory. My biggest present was when I graduated with good grades from the elementary school. I got an excellent bike with a headlight, what was really something special. And I always explored the environment. I went to various towns and places and never got tired of doing that. And I loved it. You know, there were many Hindu temples, old sultanates of Singapore, Singasari, and where the Dutch built a huge airport. It was the most modern airport in those days of Southeast Asia, where they had underground aviation fuel tanks. And that was special.
Boy, as a child, that must have been just an amazing world.
Yes, I was 10, 11, 12 years old when I was doing that. So I went to all these places. I remember that there was the old Sultan from years past. I'm talking about the 1600s, the kingdom or the Sultanate of Singasari. He had a big harem, and he had a beautiful swim pool with statues on the side, and I was fascinated by it. The females, and this goes back to the Hindu time. The females were naked from the waist up, and the water was coming through their breasts into like a fountain into the basin. In 1993, when I went back, I tried to find it again and I couldn't. I went to Wendit, what is kind of a swampy area where they grow a lot of kangkung. That's a vegetable in the watery marshes. And I roamed around there, and there were a lot of monkeys. And the monkeys were mean. They were treacherous. if you didn't give them anything, they would bite you. And that was the regular gray Java monkey. A classmate of mine was bitten in the web between the fingers and really got infected. It's like a human bite. Anyway, and then there were statues of the old Kraton, and they had been toppled, and the Dutch had put one back up. It was the height of this room. They were really big. So those were the things that I really admired and tried to discover, and didn't do any write-up on it, nothing like that, but just to see it.
Yeah.
And my mother was a person who encouraged us. She should have been a teacher. She encouraged us to do all that. She worked with us with our schoolwork, and she really. What happened is that my dad became an inspector of the Internal Revenue, and he had to audit county city buildings in the different provinces. So he spent 2 weeks here, 2 weeks there, and there were mountain provinces where he had to go. And one was in Majun. And he always took us with him for those 2 weeks to have a good time in the mountains. And he would go down to the town to work, and then in the evening he would return. And my mother would pick up the schoolwork from school and made his work. And she would do that in the early morning hours. You know, we got up at 6 and we did the homework with her, and she was really adamant that we knew it. And I still remember how keen she was to go over geography and the history of it. The migration of the Hindus first coming into Indonesia, and then later on the Arabs. And that was, of course, around 1200 when the Arabs came. For Muhammad was living in the 700s. Anyway, that kind of filled in the history of our area. And I was very fascinated by one of the stories where Mataram in the 1200s was a huge kingdom in central Java. It was the mightiest kingdom. The Khan of China sent his representative to Mataram to demand that they would become obedient to the mighty Khan of China. There were 2 areas that he could not get, that was Japan and Indonesia. For the rest, he just about controlled everything. And the king of Mataram was very angry about this and beheaded the representative. As a result, the Khan sent a huge fleet of junks, and they entered Surabaya, or what was in those days Surabaya. That was the mouth of the river Brantas. The Brantas River was huge. And they went together with the soldiers of the kingdom of Singosari. They marched up to Mataram, close to Jogja, and defeated Mataram. Then the king of Singosari betrayed the Chinese. He burned all the junks and attacked them in the back and killed off the Chinese. So he became the controller. Now, when they started, Surabaya is built on what I call the slib, all the debris that washed into the sea, and the whole city of 1 million was built on that stuff, what was deposited by the river since 1200. And the old harbor was forgotten until the Batavian Oil Company started to drill for oil in that area. Wonochroma, that was the name, and they found the remnants of the junks and coins of the Chinese and all that, and to me that was very interesting. And then the Japanese invaded in March. They invaded the island of Java, March 1st, and Java surrendered on the 8th.
In
1942. Yeah. And that, of course, turned everything upside down. They took my father prisoner several months later on. My mother and the two boys, I have a younger brother, 2 years younger. We were interned in a big camp where there were about 10,000 people. But it was set up slowly, for they rounded up all the white people, all the Caucasian people, Germans, Swedish, even that Sweden was neutral. And they were all put in this camp. And the adult males were taken away and were brought to a camp called Kasiler, just opposite from the straits what separates eastern Java from Bali. Kasiler was a camp in the making, an area that had to be developed. And we visited my dad one time. We were allowed to do that. And we were appalled about the conditions. And that was a trip by itself, for my mother was determined to see him, and it was a special trip. And I described that. Taking the two boys with her, in an occupied area where the whites were not welcome anymore. So it took guts to do that.
How did she do that? I mean,
she asked for a special permit from the Japanese. It was all in Japanese. And then she was allowed on one day to visit my dad. And there was some other women with us. We went together. And by train, we traveled all by train, except the very last end, we rented a dog car. A dog car was a horse-drawn, two-wheel vehicle. She argued about the price, finally got the price, and for the return trip too. But when we returned, the guys raised their prices, for they knew we were caught. Anyway, this is what happened. The last train was a very small, a narrow gauge track, and the engine was stoked by wood, and the cinders were flying all over the train when we traveled. And I was so curious. I want to see the area, the surrounding areas. It was really beautiful, real tropical. But the cinders really were trapped in my hair, and that was an unpleasant experience. In 1943, we were told by the camp commandant, Ikada, that everybody had to be shipped off in blocks. In that internment camp, we had 10,000 women and children. The transportations, the shipments of all these people was done piecemeal. Every week, a few blocks were heading for the railroad. They were put in trains, and I call it blinded trains. All the windows were covered. And in that heat, that was very uncomfortable. My group was shipped off as one to the last. We had a lot of discomfort. There was a lack of water. There were little kids crying. You know, I was 14, almost 15, and I went onto the balcony of these were old-fashioned cars, and each balcony had a guard, an Indonesian guard. And at first he was very upset with me, but then I told him there were all women and kids in there and there was nothing for a boy to enjoy, so he said, that's fine, that's fine. And he rather talk than, you know, sit alone. But I promised him that if the train would stop, I would go inside. And in that way, I kept the door ajar to get fresh air into the car. The facilities were very primitive. There were wooden floors. There was a little compartment. There was a hole in the floor, and if you had to do something, you had to squat. That's simple. In Surabaya, we reached that by night time. And it was a story by itself, but in essence, we were marshaled there close to the harbor. Spent most of the night there till about 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. During that time, there was an air attack on the harbor. And you can imagine if they would have hit the marshalling yards, that we would have been sitting ducks. It was very scary, to say the least. Then around 3 o'clock we were shipped off again to Samara, heading west. And I knew my map, and so I sat down again with the hi-ho, the Indonesian guard. We call them hi-hos. Actually, that's a Japanese name. And he noticed the same thing. He hoped that we would go to Kediri, where he originated, but we went to Bojonegoro, and then I knew that we were heading for Semarang or beyond. But we did stop that morning in Semarang, and we were unloaded. By that time, the kids, the small kids, were basically dehydrated. And this is a very interesting story, to me it is. For we were all lined up on the platform, crying kids, you know, and listless. Many women partially undressed due to the heat. The comfort was not there, let's put it that way. And an Indonesian conductor came up, and he had a bowl of coconut milk. And he squatted down and let the little ones drink. Then one of the Japs, I'm sorry, I still talk about Japs, they came out, and he said, "You can't do that, it's not allowed." And all these little kids looked at this Japanese fellow, and then I think he mellowed, turned around and left, and stood in the background. And this conductor said to us in Malaysian language that he felt sorry, kasihan, for the kids. He saw every week a transport come through there, and he tried to do his best to help them. So one of the women came forward and said, "God bless you." We were put in Lampersari, a huge female camp, and there were already thousands of women and children down there. The final count, when I was still there, was 7,000, but later on I heard that they had more. That was a district of the city of Semarang that they enclosed by using barbed wire. There was a big hill, and way in the past it was a school for making iron stuff. Then it was transferred into a building for soldiers, and there was on the bottom of the hill was a barn, a huge horses barn, and very primitive. And we converted that into a hospital. And there was one outside water tap. Many times over, during the day, the water was shut off. I have seen people being in that hospital. 3 to a bed. They had the most contagious diseases that you can imagine, especially with little kids. That was a disaster. We had cases of polio and meningitis all in the same crib. Amoebiasis was rampant. That is the bloody diarrhea due to an amoeba. Very contagious. There were women who volunteered as nurses. If you have several people in a bed, they all have diarrhea. You can imagine the mess. And those women who took care of them were angels. In my book. Little kids who were very, very ill, like meningitis cases and others, they tried to appeal to the commandant, his name was Samara, to put those kids in a Red Cross hospital in town. Sometimes it was granted, sometimes it was not. If it was granted, then they were shipped off. The mothers were not allowed to go with them. They didn't hear from those kids. Or they came back cured, or they had died and then they got the message. They were buried. Food was something in short supply, very short supply. We got a ladle of tapioca porridge in the morning. No additives, no sugar, nothing to it. Just the way you starch your color, and like in the olden days. For lunch, we got 90 grams of rice, cooked rice. If we were lucky, we got some cabbage or maybe a little cabbage soup. In the evening, 1 slice of bread. It was very, very small. Half an inch thickness. So starvation and malnutrition set in a real hurry. I was rounded up to live in the building on top of the hill, close to the Japanese commandant. And we had to do all the rough work. Chicars, oxen-drawn carts would come in, loaded with supplies. Well, supplies for 7,000 people. That amounts to a lot of work. And they brought in the tapioca in very solid, big, 220-pound bags. And we had to load them up on our shoulder and go 2 flights up to stack them. And I've seen many kids who couldn't handle it. That was the first time that we were lined up early in the morning, drilled like military, 3 deep, 40 in a block. They call it tango, that means reveille. And then the command came Bangkok, that meant number. We had the number in Japanese, ichi, ni, san, si, that sort. And then, we had to kiri and nore. Kiri meant deep bowing, very deep. If you didn't bow deep enough, you got a beating. Well, in the middle of this, one day, the Japanese commandant, Hashimoto, was called by the telephone, and he had his own quarters. It was a 5-foot fence. And I could see over the fence, for I was already 6 feet tall. And I looked, and he had a little table, and he put his bowl of steaming rice on that table, went inside and answered the phone. So I hopped over the fence to grab the rice. But I didn't know that he had a tiny little dog, and that dog barked. So when I was on my way back over the fence, I had one leg on the inside still, and he grabbed me by the leg and pulled me down. I was dressed only in shorts. For the rest, I was naked. No shoes, nothing. We didn't have it. He walked around me, tempting me. And he was a small guy. And I felt like beating him, for he was just mean. He had a rotan stick with a loop of leather on the end. That was a dog whip. And he hit me in the crook of my knees until all the skin was gone. That was his punishment. I never gave a peep. He lined me up again, and he made me do 10 deep knee bends. The next day he called me out again. The same thing. And he did that for a whole week. And it delayed the healing. I was lucky I did not get infected. I had to do the work and every time I had done the deep knee bends, the crusts would break and it would bleed. And all I did was just wash it off. I hated that man. I know I stole the rice, but I was so hungry I wanted it. And I would have shared it with my brother. Anyway, there are many of those stories. Then one morning, we were lined up again. Tango. And my mother was functioning as a supervisor in the kitchen. All the teenage girls were working in the kitchen. They usually started at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I brought some pictures with me. They had hard work. We used oil barrels, huge oil barrels to cook in, and what they call wachans, like a Japanese
A wok.
a wok,
Yeah.
but big ones. And they had to stoke the fires, and quite often they got wet wood and was smoking and they had no shoes, so sometimes they got burned. They had to clean out these huge drums after cooking, and what they did, they put it on the side and they crawled into it. I never forget, there was a little girl who was always doing that, and there was one water tap just outside what we called the kitchen. There were no chimneys, so the smoke went up and surrounded the roof and came out. Anyway, that morning my mother was standing there, and then all of a sudden this Hashimoto appeared, and he said, "You boys are going to march off. Take your belongings," and that's it. So I never forget my mother standing in the background, and we marched off. We were transferred to Camp Bangkok. Not Bangkok, but Bangkok. It means in Sundanese, what is in Central Javanese language, big frog or toad. And that was a Catholic church. It was a school, a high school. The church was in the middle, and there were 2 rows of buildings, classrooms. And what we didn't notice at first was that there were nuns. We ended up with a lot of nuns taking care of the hospital for the boys. The two youngest boys were 9 years of age. They were, they lost their parents. And so they put them in our camp. We had a lot of 10-year-olds, and the oldest boys were 17. We had 2, 3 18-year-olds. Normally they were shipped off to adult camps, but the Japanese commandant wanted to have some leaders, block leaders. And so we were divided in Hans, H-A-N, a Han. And so Hansho was the leader, a Dutch boy leader of a Han, and he was assisted by Kumitsu. I was in room 5, and we ended up eventually with 38 boys in one classroom where we could sleep. So that doesn't give you much room. The circumstances became very dramatic. We had 14 bathrooms for 1,400 people. So if you have a lot of sick kids, there's a lot of diarrhea, what was the most common disease in that camp, you can imagine the situation. I'm not going to describe it. We had to work every day. We had to march off, including Sundays. 400. He insisted on getting 400 boys out on the road. We built a road. We built bridges. We entered the rice fields, and we had to convert that into a field to grow cabbage for the Japanese army. And we tried to tell him in all that heat that cabbage would not do well. And he thought it was lack of fertilizer. So we had 6 months of heavy rain, 6 months bone dry. So he made us dig wells that I used to my advantage. We had to make a pond, and he promised us he would put fish in it, but he never did. He made us dig soil, make ditches, and heap it up to make rows, elevated rows, so he could grow his cabbage. And then we had to cut out banana trunks, and you can shell them, you peel them, and you can fold it double for protection against the sun for the young plants. Well, it didn't work. So he said, okay, there's lack of fertilizer. Down the road, we could see the Japanese, it was a high school, a Dutch high school, and the Japanese occupied that and made it into a military school for officers. And they were trained, and I tell you, that was a training. They had to sing and run back and forth, and you could smell the sweat. Absolutely, at that distance, we could smell them. They had, of course, bathrooms, and we had to, the little kids had to walk over there with a yoke, 2 kids to a yoke, and with a bucket, and collect all the manure from the troops and bring it back, and we had to dig holes and cure the manure. And then we had to distribute it over the fields. And that was work usually done by 12 and 13-year-olds. We, the older boys, were given hoes and had to work that way. We had to build the bridges out of coconut trees. In the rainy season, we had to stand in the rain, and that's it. The beatings were horrendous sometimes. You know, kids were hungry, so we stole from them. And if you were caught, I remember there were sweet potatoes, ubis, this size, and one kid stole one, and he was beaten, And then after about noon, around 1 o'clock, he had to stand there with the ubi held high. And this kid was weak, and if he would lower his arm, he got beaten with a stick on his back. Fortunately for him, we departed from the fields around 4 o'clock, so all he had to stay there was for about 3 hours. But that was a minor punishment. We had one occasion where some boys stole food from the table of the Japanese guards in camp. And half of the guards were Korean. Many people don't know that. And they tried to outdo the Japanese to get in favor. And they were cruel. So one, I believe that his name was Kimura. He was maybe 20 or 21 years old. And he walked up to those 12-year-old kids and burned off their eyebrows with his cigarette. And he was proud that he was doing this. We had another Korean, we called him the Bloodhound. He walked around with a field hockey stick to beat us up. And he did a good job on that. I will not give the whole story, but there was one time that we stood there. We came from the fields. We were hungry. We were thirsty. Around 5 o'clock we stood there, and they had discovered that there were kids smuggling. And he wanted to know where they got the eggs. They smuggled eggs for the hospital. And we were lined up, and he wanted to know where the Chinese were who were supplying us. And we never told him. Those two kids were still outside. He beat the Komicho up, who was in charge of that hand where the two boys belonged. We always reported the boys as sick. And one day he found out that they were not sick, they were missing. And all hell broke loose. So that night we stood there in the rain, at first, then it dried up. Then the mosquitoes ate us alive. We could hear the traffic in the city. We're not allowed to go to the bathroom. If you had to urinate, you did it on the spot. Of course, it was dark. You know, there was a war on. There was a dim light close to the church, and the Japanese guard stood there. Now, next to me was a boy, 15 years old, and his name was Leo. And he was a very nervous kid, and he received many beatings from the Japanese. For he was nervous. He was so nervous he would grimace and jerk and laugh. And when the Bloodhound paraded in front of us, and the Bloodhound was besides himself, he was really angry. For he felt he had been had, and he was, of course. So this kid, Leo, started to snicker and smile and grimace. And so this man walked up to him, took a pencil out of his pocket and tapped him on the forehead, and he called him Bodo. Bodo means stupid. And Leo smiled even worse. So the Bloodhound made a step back, raised his field hockey stick, and hit him over the temple. This kid flipped over, convulsed. Blood was coming from his left ear. He vomited, and he peed in his pants. And he was unconscious. A typical, later on, I understood it was a typical basal skull fracture. And this man wanted him to stand up to attention, so he kicked him in the ribs, but the boy didn't respond. And this all happens just next to me. I tried to grab this boy and bring him to the hospital with two other kids. And then another Japanese fella came up to me, Kimuro, and he just threatened me with a stick that I couldn't do that. The boy had to stay there. And he laid there all night in his own vomit. The Bloodhound walked off, and I didn't understand the Japanese language, but he was bragging. You could see it in his gestures and the way he talked, how skilled he had done a job in beating this kid. After the war, I have seen this boy again, and he was silly. He never really recovered. We stood there till next morning. The boys came back, they were beaten up, they were pumped up with water. They put a tube in the stomach. And then they were beaten again by the Kempetai who came in. That's the Japanese military police, it's like the Gestapo. And then they were jailed in the pigsty. We finally got off around 1 or 2 o'clock that next afternoon. That night I had to walk patrol on the inside of the building for 2 hours. Why? We don't know. It was one of those silly things that they demanded to be done. And then the day thereafter, I had to walk in the field or work in the fields again. So for 2 nights, I had hardly any sleep. There was another incident. There was a boy next to me who was how old? 13, and he was an asthmatic. And due to all this commotion, he got an asthma attack. And he sat outside on the veranda, and he was squatting down like a little monkey with his knuckles on the cool floor, trying to catch his breath. And he couldn't even speak, he couldn't eat, not drink. He was so winded. That was the first time I ever witnessed an asthma attack. And I realized right then that it was a severe one. So I talked to him and encouraged him and sat for hours next to him to try to encourage him, and finally, slowly, he started to improve. That to me, I made the realization that asthma has an emotional component. Anyway, that following day, I worked in the fields again, and I fell asleep. That was the story in a nutshell. And on it went. Starvation was horrible. My brother became very, very sick. When the liberation came, it was almost too late for him. He had contracted, I had malaria too, by the way. He had contracted malaria, became anemic from it, amoebiasis, the bloody diarrhea, what made his anemia worse. He contracted beriberi, what is B1 deficiency. He contracted pellagra, what is niacin deficiency. And the final blow was that he got scurvy. And thank God, I was quite knowledgeable about medicine, for I had helped a nurse in the initial internment camp. And my mother was always kind of a do-it-yourself, in the tropics you have to be knowledgeable. So I knew quite a few things about the tropical diseases. And a woman who read my story said that she didn't believe me. She said, a 16-year-old can't be that knowledgeable. And I said, well, those were the facts. I knew that scurvy was due to vitamin C deficiency, and I had read books about the old sea-going sailors making stops in Cape de Good Hope and other places to obtain citrus fruits or cabbage, things like that. So I stole from the Japanese commandant in the fields his lettuce and smuggled it into the camp. I had a big belt, and again, we were working and walking only in shorts, no underwear. I had a pair of shorts and a belt, nothing else. No shoes, no cap, no shirt. I had 2 tiny brass safety pins and a wire, and I strung tiny pieces of lettuce on this wire and put it on the inside of my belt. And of course they were doused with my sweat. And the other boys thought that I was crazy, but that's what I fed my brother to cure his scurvy. And how come I made the diagnosis? It was very simple. He had bleeding gums, and when he was brushing his teeth, they would bleed, and he would bump his shin bone against the sink trough, and it became painful. For you get bleeding in the periost. The periost is the layer covering the bone, and you get a swelling, and you could see the bluish spots. So this was a classical case. When the time of liberation came, my brother was unconscious. He was in and out. I tried to feed him, and the only thing what I could give him is something to drink. So the official surrender of Japan was the 15th of August. We didn't know until the 28th. 2 bombers flew over. They were B-25s, Mitchell bombers. And they came so low, they were looking for the camps. Very clearly, they knew where we were. I have no idea how they found out. But they came so low over the camp that I could see the head of the flyer and the gunner. And he wiggled his machine guns as a sign, greeting. And then they dumped leaflets, but they missed our camp. I tell you, the boys went bananas, absolutely. We climbed on each other's shoulders to wave. And all the nuns came out, and they sang the Dutch national anthem. The Japanese stood in the background, didn't do anything. So we knew that the war was over. There were many kids who were sick, and they crawled out onto the veranda just to have a look at it. But my brother could not, he was inside. So when I went back, I tried to attend to him. And then the outside world started to approach our barbed wire. By the way, the barbed wire was very high, 60 feet. And it was filled with woven bamboo. So it made the camp dark, and we couldn't see anything out on the outside, except, from time to time if we had to walk out to the fields, then we saw the outside world. We stripped the bamboo out of the barbed wire. We demanded that they would open the gate, and they refused. There were people on the outside who threw jerooks, a type of orange, into the camp. And there was one Chinaman who threw pig feed into our camp. That was a feast. But our bellies and our bowels were not up to that. So that night, everybody had diarrhea. After around 5 o'clock, I wanted to get my slice of bread, so to speak. It was corn bread. And and I walked down the hall, the veranda, and in the corner was a stairwell to the top floor. And we had 2 or 3 lazy chairs, crossimales, as they call them. And my former neighbor from Malang was laying on that chair. And he was really affected by beriberi. His whole body had swelled up. He had cracks in the skin. The fluids were running out. And I was very familiar with that, for I had been picked by the Japanese during that December, January period to prepare dead kids for burial. I suddenly realized that my neighbor didn't breathe. He was dead. And all I could wonder if he still had seen the enjoyment of the airplanes. It was very, very rough for me to handle kids who had died. I had to prepare, clean them up, wrap them up in a tikar, as a woven bamboo, and that was their crate. And then they had to be shipped off. And he always picked me, that was the Bloodhound, around noon, the hottest time of the day. And sometimes those bodies had been laying there for days. And there's an unwritten rule in the tropics that you bury a person within 24 hours. Otherwise, it becomes very odorous. I always had to take he gave me envelopes, had to write with a carpenter pencil the name of the kid or the adult. We had a few old men with us. Cut off a piece of hair and a few nails and put it in the envelope to mail it to their relatives. That was customary among the Japanese. To me, that was a horrendous task. After I had done this work, I would try to wash up, but they cut off the water supply between, I would say, 8 and 9 o'clock in the morning till 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And I would crawl. There was a water tap like this, an old-fashioned brass tap. And I would crawl under it, open the tap, and wait for the water to come out. And that was very depressing, to say the least. Right after the war, we were attacked by the Indonesian Revolution. I went out to find my mother, who was a little bit better than my brother. And I didn't know at first what to do. You know, 2 camps, my brother here, my mother here. The distance was not great. So there was another horrible experience. My mother had 2 very good girlfriends. They were younger than she was, and they had 3 little girls. When I saw those girls, they were 3, 4, and 5. They were sitting against the wall. They were totally emaciated, listless. And the youngest one, the middle one, was just, I thought she looked like she was dead, but she wasn't. And she survived. But 6 months later on, she still had to be carried. There were many mothers in that camp who really wondered about the stop of growth and development of their children, if they ever would be normal again. Anyway, I met these two women again, Mrs. Berenson and Breinfish. Very nice people. And they had supported my mother by the end. My mother had been tortured by the Japanese. Terrible. And she had malaria. So when I walked in, I brought in some tomatoes. I had a hanky that I saved, and I bartered that for tomatoes on the way down to the camp. I gave that to her, and she vomited them up. And she said, "Where's Anton, my younger brother?" And I said, "Anton is very sick. He's in the camp still, and hopefully I will bring him over here later on, for I can't take care of you both." I was just 17 by that time. So I dealt with the other women and turned back to my mother again, and she said to me, "Where is Anton?" Then it dawned on me that mentally she had deteriorated too. She recovered though, absolutely. She became as bright as she had been before, but physically she never recovered 100%. She always remained feeble. So that was a shock, to say the least. I never found out where my dad was until October, here from August to October. He was in the mountains in Western Java, and he started to work at the airport there as an accountant. So there was no way that I could join him, for the revolution was going on. We had been attacked in our camp by the Indonesians. The Japanese came back to defend us, but that's a story by itself. So there was a ship that came into the harbor, the General Van Hertz. It was only 4,000 tons. The Liberty ships were 6,000. That gives you an idea. So it was a really small ship. The native crew had been away for 5 years, and they abandoned ship. So here were the white officers and no crew. And they were laying in the inroads, riding on their anchor. So the British landed by then, and this British lieutenant said to me, "I need kids to work aboard that ship." And I said, "I volunteer, but under one condition. I blackmail you. My brother and my mother are going with me." And he said, "No problem. We need 2,000 women and children to board that ship. They have to be, as the minimum requirement, ambulatory." So LCTs came, the landing craft tankers, and we, as the destined crew, boarded the first LCT, and then the rest of the women and kids, and that was a mess. In all that heat, in the harbor, boarding LCTs, women and kids with their meager belongings, some mothers with 4 or 5 little kids, trying to board. Anyway, all the LCTs in a long lineup steamed up to the Van Hertz. And we, the boys, went aboard first. Even that it looked like quiet weather, the ship always moves a little bit. And then you get an LCT popping up and down. So all these people had to be helped up onto the gangplank, for it was an old-fashioned gangplank. You had to walk up. There was not a hole in the side of the ship, but they have nowadays. Many of those women and kids didn't make it halfway. They would stumble, fall, and whatever. We, as boys, went first. There were 14 of us. And the boatswain stood on the head of that gangplank. and he was kind of stocky, and he made an impression on me as our old grub. Anyway, later on turned out that he really mellowed. He looked at us and he said, "Who are you boys?" And we said, think about it. I had shorts, and I had received from a lady an old army shirt. And my armpits had been lanced, so I couldn't wear it really. I had it just hanging over my shoulders. So I was 95 pounds when I was liberated, and 6 feet. So all the other kids were quite similar. So when he said, "Who are you?" we said, "We are the crew." And he responded. He looked up to heaven and he said, "God help us." But we got that ship going. We got all these women, and since I had these incisions who were fresh, he didn't want me to work in the engine room. He said, "You help the women and kids." So one woman I never forget. She was young. She had a 5-year-old little girl who had suffered polio. And she was trying to bring this kid up. And she stumbled. So finally, I helped her carry the kid into the hold. I've never seen the kid anymore. But those were the pictures that you carry with you for the rest of your life. So that's how we escaped from Samara, the hellhole.
Did your brother and your mother end up with you on the...
Yes. Oh, yeah. I didn't know where they were aboard ship. The next morning I found them, so I had to work. And when we arrived in Batavia, what is Jakarta now, the ship came alongside the quay, and there was a train close by, a passenger train. So I went down on the quay and I walked up to the engine, and I said to the engine driver, "Why are you here?" "Oh," he said, "we are heading for Bandung in the mountains, and this train will hopefully bring us there. So the women and kids who want to go to Bandung can join us." So I turned around and I found my mother and brother and I said, "We have it made." And we made it to Bandung. It was the first and last train that ever went through the territory of the revolution. We were guarded by British troops, Punjabi from India. There was an incident on that trip that was funny. Each Punjab, they were old-fashioned cars. And this time we had open windows, fresh air, and each Punjabi stood on the balcony and with his rifle. They were Lee Enfield rifles. And one of the guys fell asleep and his rifle fell overboard. So the other guy had noticed that and screamed in his native language that he should wake up. And the man woke up and realized what happened. He darted into the compartment, pulled the emergency cord, and the train stopped. And that was in the middle of enemy territory. Then the British lieutenant came down the line wondering what happened, and when he heard this, he got beside himself. A soldier cannot part from his rifle. That's the rule. So they backed up this dumb train to find a rifle, and we did find it, and then steamed it, and thank God nothing happened. But I felt that I got angry I said, my God, this is silly stuff. But we made it to Bandung. And
I gotta switch a tape here just a second.
Certainly.
Now that's where your dad was, right?
Yeah.
Okay. My geography is terrible, and I'm trying to keep track of names.
Yes.
Okay, we're back.
When that train arrived, my dad had heard that the train was coming from Batavia, and he was anxious to see if he knew somebody. So he walked up to the train station, and here we found him. You can imagine, I hadn't seen him for 3 years. So we stayed in that camp, and we were attacked and surrounded and cut off from the outside world completely by the revolution. And then my dad got a call from the British that the city of Surabaya was destroyed if he please would come over and set up the accounting system. And he was put in charge. And so we flew out in a Dakota, the DC-3s, Goonie birds. And we flew to, it was in the rainy season, to Batavia, and then we stayed there for a week, and then we flew aboard a bomber, a B-25, a Mitchell, to Surabaya, only to find that Surabaya had been totally shot up. All the people had left town. It was a real empty city. So we stayed in a hotel down there, and there were no servants. All was very primitive. We found that schools were destroyed. My dad tried to teach us English. My mother taught us French. I went to a school where they taught me Malaysian and some algebra. The teachers who had survived the war had come back. Many of them were not in good health, let's put it that way. So, and there were no books. Everything, if we had a problem with algebra, and we tried to figure it out on the blackboard. So pretty soon, we realized that the schools were no good, so to speak. In contrast, was the high school that I visited in Malang. What was very top, was one of the top high schools. And they had done that on purpose, so kids could go after they graduated to Europe and join the universities and really have a good background. All I had at the age of 18, by that time I was 18 and 46, was 6 months of the 8th grade. So there was no transportation. All the sick people went first. There was a shortage of shipping. Airlines were not existing at that time. Well, there was a hospital ship that came into the harbor, and Orange, named after the Queen. They were looking for workers. So I signed up with my brother. And I became an orderly, and I took care of 30 shell shock soldiers and 5 lepers. My brother was actually too young, and he was still weak. He was only 15 by then. He was assigned pantry duty. That was the best job ever. And every evening we had chocolate milk. Now, kids nowadays pull up their noses for chocolate milk. They don't think that's a big deal. But to us, it was super. It was something unknown. For years we hadn't seen it. So that's how we traveled to Europe. And when I arrived in Europe, that was September 1946. It was cold, it was miserable. we were outfitted in Ataka. That is in the Red Sea. That's a story by itself. But anyway, when I reported in to the high school, it was a lyceum oriented on science, you know, algebra, math, and all that stuff, and chemistry. I was already a month late, and the principal looked at me and he said, "I don't know what to do with you." I never forget that. He said, "Try the 9th grade." That was it. And I went to school with 14-year-olds. Kids that I considered very bright, for I didn't know anything. You can imagine. It was a very demanding school. Dutch, French, German, English, math, stereometry, algebra, chemistry, sciences. All these things were included, biology. And by the end of this classes, they took an exam. And I made it. But I went to night school on top of the day school to catch up. And then I went on to medical school. So, but I never liked Europe. I didn't. My opinion has changed a bit, but in those days, Holland was very small, cold, people were different, and so I made up my mind I was not going to stay. I was going to leave.
What do you think about the former Dutch Indies? Is that a place that has a like for you or a dislike for you because of your experiences?
Well, at first I had a big dislike. My dad stayed behind. He stayed till 1956 and then he was kicked out. My dad loved the country and he wanted to retire in the mountains. But they didn't let him. In 1993, I went back with my wife and we visited the old places. So we went to where my wife grew up, was in Sumatra, Medan. We went to the Toba Lake, beautiful, 60 miles long. And in the middle is an island that rises 1,000 feet and is flat on top. It's an old geological fissure. I compare it always with Lake Chelan here in the state of Washington. Anyway, we visited that and my intent was to cross over, but we were seeing so many things over there that I enjoyed. It was primitive though, believe me. The old luxury was gone. The Bataks are very nice people, very aggressive, but very nice. Most of them are Lutheran, for some Swiss missionaries had come down there, where they used to be headhunters, 200 years ago. Anyway, then we were invited by a referent to come to Jakarta, and we flew over. And from there we drove into Bandung, where we visited another referent. And then from there he helped us to fly to Jogja, close to the temples, the Borobudur, the Mendut, and I have a blank here. I will come to it. We visited those temples. Then we went to Samara. And I was so grateful, for there was a referent in Magelang, that was in the mountains again, who drove us to my old camp, Bangkok. And I speak Malaysian, but I had forgotten quite a bit of it. It came back though. We asked the head nun permission to visit the Catholic school, the high school, where I had been imprisoned. Two things what struck me. One, the head nun said that she would not accept my plait that I had drawn, Where she said we did away with that by prayer, and that was it. I said, okay, you don't have to accept it. And she said, don't disturb the classes. And then she turned around and left, and so I took pictures. I took a picture of my old class, the classroom where I used to sleep, and you can see the class in session. But I didn't want to cause any trouble. So when I walked back, they had beautified the whole building. I had trouble seeing the old setup. And then I found the door of the death room. And like I explained to you, there was an emotional thing. So I took a picture of the door. And that had been transformed into a kantor. That means the women were working there for the administration. And they came outside, for they were young women, I would say, in the late 20s, early 30s. And they all wanted to know why I took a picture of a dumb door. And I said, you don't want to know about it. For I knew they were superstitious. So finally, they pushed me, and this reverend said, well, tell them. So I said, di sini ada rumah mati. This was the death room. They didn't want to go back in. They did not know, none of them, that it ever had been a concentration camp. And that shocked me. It was really a big blow. That people just forgot.
Why? I mean, why would they?
I don't know. I don't know.
Because what nationality of nuns are running it now?
Indonesian.
And they weren't the aggressors.
No.
They didn't do
No, but like I said, the head nun said that they prayed and wanted to forget about all that. But it's okay, everybody is own. But to me, it was a big blow.
Well, for a myriad of reasons. I mean, what you survived there, what you went through there, what you learned there. I mean, because the positives and the negatives, I assume, even though it was a very large travesty, but yet an inner strength that you found to survive something like that is and have it.
It was tough to survive, believe me. For many times over, I was ill, just like my brother. I had malaria bouts in October, November, 1944. I was considered in good health when the war was over. For all I had was being skinny, and I had only malaria. And I had pellagra. Pellagra it's an Italian name, what means rough skin, pellagra, due to niacin deficiency. And I tell you, that is not an easy thing to have, for you get dermatitis and diarrhea. Those are the initial phases of the disease. And the dermatitis, you get big brown spots, and they itch, horrendous. And in the sunshine, it made it worse. So my treatment was to make mud pies and cover the dermatitis. Then it was tolerable.
Well, how did you survive? I mean, was it an internal strength, a religious strength?
I believed, like my mother had told me, that you can overcome the evil of other people. And I believed in that. My mother was Bible-oriented. My dad was not. I believed that the Allied forces were going to win. We had a total news blackout. Totally. We didn't know anything what was going on outside. We were in a dark dungeon, so to speak. And it was discouraging. Sometimes I just laid there on my tiny little mattress, and I told you that I wrote a diary, and I had it rolled up in that skinny mattress, and to hide it from the Japanese. For if they would have caught me doing that, boy, I was in for a tough beating.
Just for writing a diary.
Yes, having something to read was already an offense. We were not allowed to gather, no church orientation, no music, no, how do you call that? Setups, what was allowed in the female camps, where you had, a little display of that you would quote poems or have a little cabaret or something like that. None was allowed. Even on Christmas it was not allowed. The only good thing what came out of it, to the Japanese opinion, was that on Christmas we got a day off from work, but that meant that we didn't get extra food. That's why so many kids succumbed to. I remember laying on that mattress many, many times over, and that I thought, oh, what's happening next? I had hidden a little French book, and I wanted to study it, and I was so tired and so exhausted that quite often, in the middle of trying to study it, I would just pass out. I remember the chapter's heading, one of the chapters, was La Cigogne, and that means the stork. And it made us giggle, for we said, well, in our camp we will never see the stork. So those are the little funny things that you memorize. If you talk to people out of the camps and so on, quite often the first thing they will try to memorize is the funny things, the little things that you thought were cute. Like when we were shipped off from Camp Malang, when the first transport, there were many mothers with little kids, and little kids are in diapers. So one mother had a little girl, and she took the little potty and put it like a rucksack on this girl's back. And the Japanese lined us all up for Bangkok number. And they did a bad job on that. Oh, they had to do it again and again, and kids were moving around, and so this little kid had to go potty. So the mother took the pot, put it on the ground, on the road, and the kid sat on it, watching the whole show. And we thought it was hilarious. Simple things. There was one mom who had 3 little girls, and for some dumb ruling, each had to carry his own little food supply when being placed on transport. My mother put 3 in 1, and she almost received a beating for it. So this mother with the 3 little girls, she made 3 bamboo sticks and a red sack, a tow sack, I think that's what you call it here. And she wrote on a little red flag, "We don't like this town anymore," like a joke. And the little kids walked with their little tow sacks. And there was a certain humor. My mother never knew what I did. We were supposed to be loaded on the trucks, and I helped all the old ladies. And he was only 14, almost 15. And we had to bow for the Japanese flag, and I hated it. And here I looked up, and there was the Japanese flag. I lowered it, ran to the smallest room in the house, the bathroom, and draped it over the toilet seat. And then I boarded the truck. I never told my mother. She would have died.
Luckily, the Japanese never found out because...
Well, they must have found out afterwards, but then they didn't know who did it. So...
Do you think you were exceptionally mature for your age, or...
I became mature in a hurry. I was not at first. Not at all. But I learned real fast. In the internment camp, my mother had a friend who was a nurse. And there was one doctor in the camp, and that was in a Mason building. And it had a tower. And they put a clandestine library in there. And I had to repair the books. And people came in and out. And in the afternoon, the doctor held office in there. And the nurse helped. And she made me wise on a lot of things. And I had to clean up. And just before we were put on transport, she came in one afternoon late, around 5, 6 o'clock, and I was not really done cleaning up, for I was nosing through the books, the medical books. And I was kind of looking up things. And she caught me. And she never said a word. She said, it's okay. We're going to be put on transport anyway. That was all the comments she gave. But she taught me a lot of things, and so did my mother. For I had a tropical ulcer in the female camp. And like I told my colleagues later on in life, a tropical ulcer, the hallmark is it never crusts over. You know, if you have a regular ulcer, a bacterial type, it forms a crust. The tropical ulcer is a virus, and it never forms a crust, and it oozes. It just oozes the hell out of it. So from a blister on my heel, overnight it became a dollar-size ulcer, and it started to threaten my heel bone and the Achilles tendon, and it is well known that it would eat it up. So a circulating nurse was coming at the request of my mom to help me, and I soaked it day and night in salt water. And she had silver nitrate sticks and burned it out. Well, here I was going for 2-3 weeks, and it didn't heal. It didn't get bigger, but it just oozed. I always had a kind of a towel laying on the knees at night, for we were not allowed to have lights, by the way. So one night I felt something crawling over my foot. Fine stuff. So I grabbed a match, and my mother was upset about that, for matches were hard to come by. And I lit it. And I looked, and there were thousands of tiny little golden ants eating my ulcer. And they cleaned it out. And that made it heal. So every night when I went to bed, I said, come on.
Wow.
It gives people the creeps listening to that. But at first, you know, I was, oh my goodness, what is happening? But it worked. Many primitive methods.
And it sounds like a lot of this you retained information real well even as a child.
Yeah.
And I know seeing just looking at your diary, how meticulous it was. So there was a vast amount of knowledge that you had gained, and also it looked like a discipline, and then the fact that you had drawn out the camp and where everything was. I mean, that to me is not an average 16, 17-year-old boy's work. That is somebody that...
Well, I was kind of forced into it, you know. I felt if I had to retain myself in camp, for I was too sick to go out like when I had malaria, in between the chills, I had very little to do. And then I was doing this. Yeah. My writing was okay.
What type of things did you write? Because I couldn't read it, obviously. I mean, it looked very meticulous. And
what happened, what transpired in a week's time. Little notes.
So you're describing.
Yeah.
More than I feel this, or I'm worried,
No,
I'm scared.
that's right. There was one time where I thought that things were silly. The moon was up, and the little kids were watching the moon, and all of a sudden a dark cloud came and swallowed the moon. And they said, oh, the moon had disappeared, and now the earth was going to disappear. And they screamed, and they were scared. And I told them they were silly. I thought it was nothing, absolutely, to me it was a disgrace. But that's just the feeling of a 16-year-old, I guess.
So this camp took away quite a bit of your adolescence.
All of it. 14 through 17.
You didn't have the high school sweetheart. You didn't have the things that young boys go through.
Yeah.
You were an instant adult.
Okay. This is what I wrote in my book. At the end, if we got us in the evening, the only thing what we would discuss was recipes, what food was like. We were so hungry. If you gather 16 and 17-year-old boys nowadays, the talk would be going out, cars, and girls. Girls were not in our mind. Absolutely not. There was no desire. And that was due to the starvation.
That's, I mean, I've heard adult prisoners talk about the food aspect of it, but I never thought about removing, because there's nature. I mean, there's biology.
But the biology was such that the hormonal development was not there either. Nil.
Wow. Why do you think the Japanese handled it the way that they did? I mean, there are German POW camps where, when you listen, it was a summer camp. You were in a hellhole.
I was in a labor camp. Heavy, heavy labor. The initial intent of the Japanese was to round up all Caucasians in Southeast Asia. Australians, Dutch, Americans, and British. And after they would have won the war, they wanted to ship them off to Europe. Then they started to lose the war. And then they interned us, for they figured that we would, do something that they didn't like. And then they starved us. And time again, if we asked for food, especially for medicines, we asked for quinine. We call it quinine, like the British do. And they would say, the Japanese troops don't have it, you don't get it. And then we reminded them that the western part of the island of Java produced 90% of the world quinine. And that they had it. And we received a beating for just mentioning that. There was once an epidemic, and several boys, teenagers, died from the worst type of malaria. Black water fever, they called it in Africa, where you get the bleeding through the kidneys. And that's why you call it black water. That was an epidemic that was so bad that even the Japanese realized to protect themselves that they should feed us quinine. for they were afraid of it. We had typhoid fever in the camp. And the Japanese were so scared of it that they put a cloth in front of their mouth and they avoided that area.
Was there, the area wasn't lacking for food, or was it?
No.
So it was purposeful.
Yes.
Starvation.
Yes. For they always said if we complained, the cemetery is waiting for you. They didn't care. And here I always had the impression that Japanese men would love little kids. And I've seen many times over, they didn't care. In the female camps, all these little kids. I can tell you a lot more things, but I just wanted to, get through the whole picture, so to speak.
Yeah, and I'm gonna have to go here in a second because I got Alex is coming. Alex,
Yeah.
I'm terrible with names. Who's
From from Lakewood.
Lakewood.
Yeah.
What do you hold an animosity towards the Japanese from this, or?
They have never apologized, except sometimes as an individual, but the government didn't. Their attitude as the old guard is still terrible. The head of the Kempeitai, what was the Gestapo, survived the war. He was imprisoned and let go by the American government. And he became the head of education in Japan. And he forbid that anything was to be taught in the schools about World War II. And those are the things that I hold against him. I had a priest tell me, I knew him quite, I'm not Catholic. And he said, you have to learn to forgive. For Jesus died on the cross for this reason. And I said, as long as they don't really truthfully apologize, I cannot forgive them. I'm not holding anything against the American Japanese who were here. As a matter of fact, the Nisi, I thank him for fighting on our side. But the truth is that there were people among those Japanese citizens here in this country who favored Japan. But nowadays, you can't say that. And I'm just leave it be.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I appreciate it. I still have you tied up there, so I'll get you.
I forgot to drink my coffee, but I will.